Today was another day of class in the Midoriya Foundation. Given just how many children there were, it's not like he could put them all in one classroom all at once. So he decided to have individual class times. Basically, he would split everyone up into groups of 12. And once he was done teaching one class, he would move on to the next. Thankfully, since Izuku cut out most of the fluff that schools added, classes didn't go on too long. So he could get through everyone without taking all day. It was bright and early, and Izuku was standing in front of what he referred to as Class 1. Class 1 included Eri, Kei, Fu, Kiba, Sanson, Kyoku, Shiroku, Yami, Fuku, Otoko, Kai, over video call, and Mu, who was wearing a sheet. And all of them were waiting for Izuku to start the lesson. Alright, everyone. I'm happy to introduce you all to your new teacher, Izuku said. Huh? Was Fuku's response. Although everyone else did look rather surprised. The door opened, and in came what could only be disturbed a giant yellow octopus man. He wasn't quite an octopus. His head was a round yellow ball, with two small black dots that seemed to be his eyes and a big Cheshire cat-like smile. Most of his body was covered in an academic dress. A large black cloak with a bit of red down the center, and some blue lines along the sleeve. The only other two pieces of clothing he wore were a black tie with a crescent moon on the bottom and a small graduation cap. Coming out of the bottom of the robe were thick yellow tentacles, and from the arm sleeves were four thinner tentacles, two coming from each side. Hello, children, the octopus man said in a cheery voice. My name is Kyoshi Shirji, and I'll be your new teacher as of today. Kei raised her hand. Yes, Ms. Kei, Kyoshi called. What is your question? Are you a man with an octopus quirk? Or an octopus with a man's quirk? Kei asked. Neither. I am a full-fledged human, my dear. And my quirk has nothing to do with octopus, Kyoshi said. Whoosh! Suddenly the man vanished, and then appeared behind Kei with a gust of wind. This is my quirk, Kyoshi said. I don't know why it makes me look like this. So you can teleport? Kai asked eagerly. No, that wasn't teleporting, Kiba corrected. That was super speed. He was moving so fast that none of you could see it. All except me, of course. In truth, she had barely been able to track his movement as well, appearing as a blur in her vision, meaning even with her immense speed, this guy was still significantly faster. That's correct, Lady Kiba, Kyoshi said, dashing in front of her desk. His face turned green and a white O appeared on it. Very good. Kyoshi then dashed back to the desk at the front of the room, next to Izuku. Now then, shall we get the lesson started, Mr. Midoriya? Of course. Izuku moved from the front and walked all the way to the back of the room. I'll be watching this first lesson for today. But all of you please focus on Mr. Shurji. Now please begin. Alrighty then. Kyoshi coughed to clear his throat, before continuing. Today we'll start learning about World War III, or the Quark Wars. Now can anyone tell me when the Quark Wars started? 2061? Eri answered, although she sounded a bit unsure. That's correct. Kyoshi confirmed, pulling out a remote and calling down a projector. Quarks first appeared in 2040, and for 21 years tension grew all around the world. After quarks started appearing, the world was in a state of chaos. Most governments weren't exactly jazzed about citizens having superpowers that they could use as weapons. And so many governments quickly enacted anti-quark policies. This ranged from simply banning the use of quarks, to round up every odd person in the country and imprisoning them, to killing them on sight. Each of Kyoshi's sentences was accompanied by pictures put up on the wall behind him, of people with quarks being either rounded up or attacked by police. The children reacted with a combination of disgust and horror, but none of them seemed all too surprised. As I'm sure you've guessed, many people were not pleased about this, Kyoshi explained, showing a new slide of people protesting. Of course, the people with quirks were against this, as well as the relatives of people with quirks. But there were a fair amount of sympathizers who had no personal relation to people with quirks. Although that said, they were all the minority at first, as many of the quirkless people were very much against those with quirks. And quirk discrimination ran wild. As he spoke, images of protests and protesters being attacked by police or other citizens went up. Surprisingly enough, however, as time went on, pro-quirk movements became more and more popular. Kyoshi explained. Mainly for two reasons. The first being that more and more people started having children who had quirks. And second, in a rather surprising display, as time went on, people started to realize that their initial reactions were a bit unreasonable, to say the least. Quirk supporters did their best to take pictures of the horrible things happening to people with quirks. Namely, human experimentation. Many countries started experimenting with people with quirks, mostly to try and figure out the source of their powers, and how to use them for their own purposes. Although sometimes it was more torture than experimentation, pro-quirk forces risked their lives to get pictures of these horrible things. Sneaking into quirk concentration camps and quirk experimentation labs. And thanks to this, the public became a bit more sympathetic. However, that just about evened the two sides numerically, with plenty of people carrying anti-quirk sentiments. Kiba raised her hand. Why didn't the people with quirks just fight back? Because they were children, Kyoshi explained. Remember, quirks only appeared in newly born babies at first. So when the governments of the world started gathering them, there was little they could do. They were reliant on their parents to try and hide them away. They had to stay hidden. Of course, for people with mutant quirks, this was impossible, but for others, they simply needed to never use their quirks in public. This continued on for 21 years. Hate for either side is growing more and more, and the children born with quirks eventually grew up. And eventually, they'd had enough. And they did start fighting back. Thus we enter the Quirk Wars. The slide changed again, now showing people with quirks fighting back against soldiers and police. Now it's unknown how, when, or what properly started the Quirk Wars, Kyoshi explained. It's believed that one person with a quirk started fighting back against the government, but we have no way of knowing where or when, or even if that was the case. But regardless, people started fighting back against governments worldwide. And while people had tried fighting back before, this time they were actually winning. Those with quirks were the first. They gathered together and started using their powers to slaughter their enemies, taking their weapons and giving them to their sympathizers. And once the Quirk War started, it didn't take long for it to end. You see, the Quirk War wasn't your typical war. It wasn't fought on some kind of battlefield, or even in certain areas. The fights were happening everywhere, including very populated areas, meaning they couldn't use their big weapons without harming the public. That didn't stop certain countries, but that only made things worse for them, as those acts horrified the public, who started supporting the pro-Quirk armies more and more. Another advantage the pro-Quirk armies had was speed and surprise. Quirks weren't like many of the weapons the government used, that had to be transported and set up. Quirks could be used in an instant, meaning they had a great offensive advantage, and they intended to use it to its fullest, not giving the governments of the world any time to get out their more powerful weapons, or even make proper strategies. They also specifically targeted people in charge of the anti-Quirk forces, something that was easy to do, because those people were public figures and government officials. This caused massive issues, as it essentially left most of the anti-Quirk forces without any leadership, causing them to fall apart even faster. Thus the anti-Quirk War only lasted about half a year at most. In some parts of the world, it ended sooner. Half a year? Fuku gasped in shock. That's right, it was a pretty short war. Mainly because it was more of a slaughter than a war. Kyoshi explained. All around the world, the war ended one way or another. Some governments simply undid any anti-Quirk laws and thus ended the war there. Some governments had all of their people killed and replaced. And some were just completely dismantled and turned into something else. And while the Quirk War lacked in longevity, it made up for that in its astonishing death count. Roughly 41% of the population died due to this war. Almost everyone's eyes widened in shock. That's almost half the people in the world, Kiba whispered. almost speechless from what she just heard. It was in fact a horrible and dark time in human history, and it holds the record for the highest death count of any war in history, Kyoshi explained. And the reason for such a high death count was due to something called the equality purges. You see, the people of the pro-quirk army were typically those who hated any form of discrimination, racism, sexism, homophobia, and things like that. And now that these people were armed, and they weren't obeying the laws anymore, they decided it was the perfect time to remove such people from the world. And so they used their weapons and their quirks to slaughter anyone who had a discriminatory view, or anyone who they believed had a discriminatory view. And so the pro-quirk forces would slaughter over 1 billion civilians. Ugh! Kyoku groaned in disgust. People. And thus, we conclude our lessons on the Quirk Wars, Kyoshi said. Of course, there are many things we skipped over, and if you want to learn more about it, then feel free to do your own research. And if you have any questions, feel free to come and ask me. Now, since today's subject was pretty heavy, we'll be ending class early to give you all some time to process that, and then unwind. Class dismissed. So how was my first lesson? Kyoshi asked eagerly. It was now evening, and Kyoshi had just finished up his last class for the day. And now he was sitting in Izuku's office for evaluation. You did well. Of course, I'd like to observe you a bit more, but my attention is needed somewhere else. Izuku sighed. So I'll have the maids watching your lessons and reporting back to me. I hope you don't mind. Oh, I'm more than fine with it, sir, Kyoshi said, saluting with one of his tentacles. After all, it's not common that people would hire someone with my history. True, but I need talented people who are willing to be loyal to me and my family, Izuku said. I've seen your ability to both teach and your ability to fight. And since you accepted the mind probe, I'm confident I can trust you. Even if you were a former lieutenant for All for One, I believe people can change. I am forever grateful for that, Mr. Midoriya, Kyoshi said, bowing his head. One more thing. Izuku pulled out a file from his desk. This is a little help. I've written down everyone's learning habits, what they're best at, and what they could use help with, as well as their general learning habits. Some will be easier to work with than others. I understand, sir, Kyoshi said, grabbing the file with his tentacle. I'll make sure they all understand what I'm trying to teach them. It's a promise. TCH. Lu scowled at a book he was reading like it had personally offended him. Lu was currently sitting down in the library, with a book in front of him that seemed to be making him very displeased. The Quirk War, give me a break. Lu huffed. This must be quite the hard pill to swallow. Lu jumped in his seat and quickly turned his head to the side to see Kyoshi standing there. Don't do that. Geez, just because you can sneak up on people doesn't mean you should. You don't see me teleporting behind people just to surprise them. Sorry. I just noticed you were reading more about the Quirk Wars, and I thought maybe I could be of help. Kyoshi offered. I know quite a bit about that war after all. Do you think I could stop it? Lu asked, not looking Kyoshi in the eye. If I went back in time, do you think I could stop it? Not a chance, Kyoshi answered in that same peppy tone. Unless you stopped quirks from happening in the first place, this kind of thing was always destined to happen. It's all just a progression of human nature, and the exploding of tension that had been rising for years, long before quirks came around. People back then predicted that World War III would plunge the world into a nuclear apocalypse, and perhaps that would have happened if the nature of the war was different. So even if you could stop quirks from appearing, you might create an even worse future. Lu didn't respond at first. His body tensed up even more, his hands balled into a tight fist, and his teeth started grinding against each other. So I guess coming to the future was a good thing, huh? If I'd been around. He'd been told that going back was a bad idea. But being told that was one thing. Reading about what they did to people with quirks back then. The experiments. The camps. The torture. That was another. Dark times, Kyoshi said. Fortunately you didn't have to go through that. I freaking hate humans. Lu huffed as he slammed the book shut.